Welcome back to the Unapologetic podcast. My name is Brandt Merritt.
I'm Jonathon Woodyard.
We're joined again today by our president, Dr. Melson. How are you?
Doing great. Glad to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, you're welcome. And a few different things I want to try to talk about today. You've been out and about at some conferences with other presidents and higher ed leaders that wanted to debrief on. And then there's a lot of, I'll call it noise, but there's also real changes happening out in the marketplace with the new administration and things around higher education. So talk through some of that and how it impacts us. But just for icebreaker, I wanted to comment on, this is like your weather. We've been dealing with some
Minnesota weather. I mean, it's
Quite Minnesota weather.
It's not quite. I was up in Minnesota a couple of weeks ago, and I was reminded the differences. This is cold. I mean, it's been cold here, right? It's not warm. There's snow on the ground. But in Minnesota a couple of weeks ago, I was reminded of the pain that cold can bring. I mean, it was walking from the hotel over to the conference center was painful. Your face,
brutally cold.
Yeah, it's brutally cold. So it's different. But yeah, it is cold here. We closed campus yesterday, but our facilities team did a great job clearing sidewalks. We're looking at sidewalks out there now, clearing sidewalks, clearing parking lots, getting campus ready to reopen today. So students are back in class. And
how do we make decisions on, this is like inner workings, pull back the curtain on. So when a university like SBU has inclement weather, how do we decide if campus is open?
That's a great
students beg the president to close. I can tell you that.
I'm sure you were getting text messages yesterday. I'm getting text messages. Last night, I'm literally laying in my bed, and a student texted me and said, "Hey, when are you going to close campus for tomorrow?" And I'm like, "I'm not. Go to bed. Study." Or they had a test today, and they're like, "I'm not studying for tests. Go to class tomorrow." But yeah, it's a great question. How do we make a decision? It's a few people. So myself and Scott Motes, our CFO, and then Robbie Bryant, our director of facilities. We really asked Robbie, hey, looking at the weather incoming, do we think our facilities team, our grounds crew are going to have enough time to get to campus, clear things off, and make it safe to where students, faculty, staff, guests can be on campus? If we think we can have campus open and ready and it's safe for people to be here, safe for people to drive here, then we'll open campus. If we don't, we'll close it. So we usually confer, and then I'll generally shoot a text message to Dr. Melson, say, here's what we're thinking, recommendation, he'll sign off on it, thumbs down, and then that's how and then we talk to you, and you've got to
spread
out
the word.
The communications piece for campus. But our desire for those things is we just want people to be safe getting here. We don't need people slipping and falling on our steps, sidewalks, things like that. We just want people to be careful and be safe. So that's what drives our decisions.
We do we don't coordinate decisions, but we do get feedback from the school district, all of our schools when we're talking about this campus of, are they open or not? What are they thinking? Because that has impacts on, parents and how that
absolutely.
looks.
So it's a community effort. So I'm on a text message or text thread with one of the assistant principals over at the high school, just hey, what are you all thinking? What are we doing? He actually texted me the other day and said, are you guys going to make a decision early or late? So conversations like that. But again, just the desire is we want people to be safe. We want to take care of our students, take care of our team, do what's best.
And today is a beautiful day. We can see the sunshine out there, blue skies, white on the ground, beautiful snow. Yeah. You can't see that here in the podcast room, but you can definitely see it as we're looking out the window. So to me, this is like the best of all worlds. You get the little snow
with the sun,
beautiful sunshine. It's about as good as it gets.
Campus is pretty
beautiful campus.
And are we going to make it official here on the podcast? Are you delegating authority to me?
100%. I'm going to be out of the country starting tomorrow. So I will give your cell phone number.
Go ahead and give his cell phone number now.
We will post it on the screens. If you want to cancel class, call Brandt Merritt.
So, Brandt, you'll take the lead on that. You're already take the lead on our communication plans.
This is actually way more streamlined. We finally cut the bureaucracy out of the decision-making process.
We'll cut out the middleman.
Give it to you.
We'll get to bureaucracy in a minute. So the other kind of fun thing, you mentioned it just a few minutes ago, we got a new video up for admissions that kind of walks through steps for how students can apply. And I think it's a great new tool that we haven't had in this format before.
It's a fantastic video. I just watched it yesterday, and Eli and Katie did a great job. And I'll post it on my social media. We'll get it on LinkedIn. We'll get it sent out, and we can do the same thing across the board. And I think it'd be helpful for families as they're thinking about, hey, what is the process to apply, and walks them through it and gives really good samples.
We had previously like 5 or 6 videos on our YouTube channel that covered the similar topics, but they were, again, dispersed with different videos. And it was a neat, I think, idea. It served a great purpose when they did it 2 or 3 years ago, but it was each admissions counselor at the time taking a topic, kind of showing parts of campus. The hard thing with those is there's always turnover in admissions offices or any office within an organization, and some of the things have changed since then. So this consolidates it into one video with just 2 of our folks.
Great video,
like
super helpful. They did a great job.
Yeah, so we're excited for it.
Yeah.
So 2 of the things we wanted to get into, one was broadly Christian higher ed, things that are maybe new or top of mind with some of the conference feedback that you got, and then Trump administration, Department of Education, some of the things that we're hearing or experiencing. But I want to start there, Dr. Melson, if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, January is always an important month for higher education presidents. We gather together in Washington, usually each January. And there's 2 different groups that we're part of. One's the CIC, which is the Council of Independent Colleges. That's about 900 colleges and universities across the country. Then there's the CCCU, which is the Council of Christian College and Universities that we're also part of. That's mostly like-minded institutions like SBU, and there's 150 or so of those institutions worldwide. But all of those presidents gather into DC, and one of the days we do is an advocacy day. So we actually go to the Hill. We meet with our congressional leaders. We have 2 great senators in the state of Missouri, Senator Hawley and Senator Schmidt, that are open. Their offices are fantastic to us. I was actually there for the confirmation hearings, literally on the Hill the same day the confirmation hearings for RFK were taking place. So you have a brand new administration in government. You have these Senate confirmation hearings. So it was a buzz. I mean, there was media everywhere. You're on the Hill. You're meeting with your legislative leaders, and yeah, I just want to again gratitude to Senator Hawley and Senator Schmidt. They very much know SBU. They know our institutions. They're supportive of our institutions. They're pro-Christian higher education. They want to support the work that we do. They're behind us all the way. In fact, Senator Schmidt tells a great story. He actually played football at Truman, and he played at SBU, played football, against SBU when he was a student at Truman. He said the hardest hit he ever took on a football field was in Bolivar, Missouri, during a football game right out here on our field. And so he very much remembers SBU. Okay. So he understands Bearcats. And
built different in Bolivar.
Yeah, built different in Bolivar. So he remembers that hit. So Senator Schmidt, if you're listening, that's your good story. I love that story. So anyway, so part of that time is advocating not just for Christian education, but also for things like the Pell Grant. We really think the Pell Grant is an important aspect for students like SBU. We have, I think, 46%, almost half of our students are Pell eligible, which means they come from lower socioeconomic families. I was a Pell Grant student. I probably shared that on this before. When I was a student, I was a first generation student. So making sure that our legislative leaders are thinking about the implications, even as we talk more today about the Department of Education, how does that really impact students' lives, boots on the ground, especially related to the affordability of college and how the Pell Grant makes that a possibility. Yeah. When the Pell Grant was introduced, I think 52 years ago, it actually took about 80%, it covered about 80% of the cost of college. Today it produces or provides about 20% of the cost of college. And that's true across the board, private, public. So that's a really important thing for us to think about. How do we continue to grow the Pell Grant? Most administrations have been pro-Pell Grant, pro-growth in the Pell Grant. And I think we're going to continue to see that with the Trump administration. There's no, at this point, there's no indication that there's any shrinking back. In fact, most everyone's leaning into how do we continue to support those families. And I would just say at SBU, one of the things I love, we have a lot of students who come to SBU. I think we're still ranked number 40 in the nation on social mobility, which means students come, they get on an economic ladder that increases their social mobility and economic strength as they graduate. And we're recognized nationally for that. And that's pretty cool. I mean, I think that's one of our unique distinctives. So being able to attract those students to SBU, have that federal support is really, really important. Wow. So there's big conversations that, around the college, the cost of college, affordability, those conversations are always a big conversation. I would say, one of the other interesting conversations that continues is just around this idea of civility and civil discourse and in the public square. How can we try to bridge the gap, especially as Christian higher education, to create an environment where we can disagree on things and we can bring people together. We don't have to continue to bifurcate our communities. And I think the polarization of society is seen in a lot of different ways. We certainly saw that through the election. But a lot of conversation at both of these conferences, CIC and CCCU, is how do we actually bring more civil discourse together? And I think we can actually take the lead in higher education related to that.
Well, that was just on that piece in particular, that even harkens to the fall when we had the Heritage Foundation recognized us for being a great option. They look around the country, pick very few schools. We're one of two in Missouri that was selected, but one of their criteria was free exchange of ideas, or they celebrate freedom, and that's certainly a hallmark of what we do. We've got convictions and things that we feel strongly about that we're not going to change about our beliefs or what the university stands for, but we will certainly talk and create an environment where students can get used to being challenged with different ideas.
Absolutely.
And then how to frame that through a Christian worldview and actually be able to successfully navigate that. And as I leave, sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, that's okay. I just think what you're saying, creating a certain type of citizen that can engage in their communities in winsome ways, in, speech that's gracious and kind, seasoned with salt, really gets to what we've talked about several times here. We're not merely trying to confer degrees. We're trying to shape a certain type of person.
That's exactly right.
And so historically, if you look back, I know we're both, look at Marsden's work on the Soul of the American University, the universities of yesteryear, their aim was to create citizens, people who could go out and live as citizens of the United States, not merely go out and get a job somewhere, but a certain type of person. And really that just speaks to when we talk about education here, we are about shaping, forming a certain type of person, a mature young man or young woman who can flourish in society and be a contributing member to society.
Absolutely. And I think there's a sense in which Christian institutions can lead out with gracious Christianity and lead into this conversation in a way that actually brings others into the conversation, so that we can lean into our conviction, our Christian identity, while at the same time having civil discourse and creating citizens that are actively involved in their communities. I read this week, I think we probably all read the testimony by the founder of Wikipedia. And in there, he talked about as a child, he was always told that he asked too many questions. And that kind of led him into an interesting direction. He even says at the very end, he still asked too many questions. But one of the things I love about us, even in our honors program and all across our academic areas, we actually want students to ask lots of questions. Yeah. We love the Socratic method. We love the opportunity of conversations that allow our thinking and our thoughts to grow and spur them on, held within those convictions as we are as an institution, but spurring that on. And I think you see some of that. When you're in DC, especially during this kind of major shift of administrations, there's a lot of political shifts that are taking place in the country, and people are probably feeling some of the uncertainty around those things. In fact, one of the big conversations we're going to talk about today is the Department of Education and those potential changes that are taking place. And I think in some sense that creates an unease around our country. And I think people sometimes hear what they fear, and we want to lean into that a little bit and try to maybe dispel some of the things that people are hearing, and also realize that there's a bureaucracy of conversation that takes place here, but then there's also boots on the ground of what's the application of these things? How does it really impact us? And what's the timeline on this? A lot of these things, Trump has jumped in, he's making very quick changes, but quick executive orders don't necessarily bring about quick change in a bureaucratic environment, right? I mean, it's going to take a long time.
Or legal environment.
Or legal environment, right? I mean, many of these have already been blocked, in the court. So, or at least there's attempts to block things in the court. So yeah, it'll take some time. I mean, there's some of these things only Congress can actually do. If we're going to eliminate, for example, the Department of Education, only Congress could act to do that. But there are some things, Trump is being true to his word. He is doing exactly what he said he would do on the campaign trail. And we have to think about, what are the implications of that? And some are wide sweeping, and others will be, will take years to kind of implement and figure out where these things land. And I think that's important. But I think there's some practical things we could talk about even today, as people might be reading or hearing or have some of that anxiety around those issues.
Yep, for sure. One piece you mentioned earlier, jumping into the administration changes, was mergers and acquisitions and partnerships, was something you had mentioned in the conferences you were at, which for us is relevant. I mean, we have done, I think, actually a pretty good job and unique in our sort of culture in our region for partnering with a hospital system in Springfield, the Mercy hospital system, for healthcare education, but then also looking at other colleges that may be specifically in healthcare so far, but what are other things that we maybe offer that they don't, or they offer that we don't? So partnering with Drury University,
Mission
University.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you've been in the lead of a lot of those conversations. And so how
I think we've been leaning into that. So mergers and acquisitions, partnerships have been a big conversation. You'll kind of see this conversation across the landscape of higher education. Roughly 5,000 colleges and universities across the nation. We know that there's a shrinking number of college students in the traditional age, 18 to 22-year-olds. We know about the demographic shifts and the enrollment cliff, those kind of things that are coming. And some institutions kind of post-COVID came to realizations like they're just not viable. So you're seeing some schools close. We've seen that in our region. We've seen that across the country. So a lot of conversations are, what are some ways that we can think about mergers and acquisitions to continue the mission of some of these institutions, or to take their students and put them in an environment where they can flourish. One of the ways we've really seen that is, I think, a step is really toward the partnerships. And how can we partner with other institutions? Instead of saying every institution has to be subject matter experts at everything, invest in everything, what are some areas where we really flourish? So, we have long-standing programs in our business area, our nursing area, our education area, and nursing in particular. We have these partnerships with Drury and Mission University, for example, where we're training their nurses. And we're talking about reciprocal ways in which we can partner with other institutions as well. And just thinking about how we can partner with one another. Who are some of the best trainers in XYZ area that might be able to serve SBU, and vice versa? Where are some areas where we can lean in and provide some of that training? So instead of, going toward the mergers and acquisitions, how can we start with partnerships to help all institutions flourish during this downturn time, and hopefully turn that around for all institutions that they can flourish? Because institutions have a really important, economic impact in their communities. They have a really important transformational impact in their communities in training, the workforce. And when we talk about workforce, no better place to think about workforce than teachers and nurses, and doctors and business leaders and pastors across the country. So there's a lot of work that we do here that we think is really important and relevant for the future. And whether it's in new areas like AI or cybersecurity or computer science, or it's in more traditional areas where we continue to flourish, we want all of these programs to be able to support the next generation of our society, which really then kind of dovetails into this conversation around the Department of Education, because one of the things for higher education to flourish, whether that means we don't need 5,000 colleges and universities, and perhaps we need a fewer number of those to serve our country, how are we going to make sure that the next generation has access to affordable education that continues to make sure that we can lead as a nation in providing the kind of transformational education that really does impact the world, to create those citizens that are creating good in their communities? Part of what we do is for the common good. Yeah. So not just as Christian universities, and we're unapologetic to say, listen, we want to prepare and equip students in whatever sphere of life they're in to go and impact the world for Christ. Part of why they're doing that is for the common good of their communities and to be good citizens. So I think some of these changes at the federal level do have implications for us at SBU. And certainly, the Department of Education is not just about higher education. It's about K through 12. And there's a lot of big pieces within this conversation that we have to think about. What are the local, state level, federal level implications of any of these changes? And then, of course, for us, how does it impact our students' boots on the ground?
Yeah, and the Department of Education is sort of the big gorilla in the conversation, because President Trump campaigned pretty not subtly.
No, it was very explicit.
Right.
That he thought the Department of Education should be dismantled. And one of the things even I learned through it too was nothing's permanent, and none of these things have been around forever. That it was actually President Carter that created the Department of Education. So it's not like it's been around for 100 years.
Yeah,
it's been around
1979. So we're talking 45 years. Now, I think it goes way back. Initially, I think like 1874 with Andrew Jackson or something, there was some type of initiation. But what we know today of the Department of Education, yes, 45 years old. And it's interesting because even in our conversation, think about this. The GI Bill precedes the Department of Education. Yep. The Pell Grant, Senator Pell introduced 52 years ago, precedes. the Department of Education. So there's a lot of things that we already doing as a country before we actually had this department, which is interesting. And I think there were a lot of local and state level initiatives. And it's interesting how this kind of pendulum swings, because when federal government steps in, then it sometimes takes over certain things that were happening at the local and state level. It's not that local and state level have abandoned education by any means, right? I mean, they're still investing and that, but there's a different layer, or there's an added layer to that. And some of that is around funding, which obviously highly impacts institutions at the higher education level with regard to Title IV funding and what we know is, student loans and direct loans and things like the Pell Grant, which is somehow is still going to have to be an important part of this conversation, because at this point, no one has implied, and I think you even said today as you were listening to the Senate confirmation hearing, that no one's backing away from what's going to happen with the federal government still actively being involved in providing student loans and Pell Grants. In fact, you actually said from what you heard today, leaning into that.
Linda McMahon, in her confirmation hearing with the Senate committee that she was testifying with, they asked her point blank, it was Bernie Sanders, said, can you guarantee that Pell Grants won't go away during this administration? She said, yeah, Pell Grants will be part of it. She actually wants to expand Pell Grants as part of her. Now, what the Secretary of Education wants versus what the president wants, or not, may be different priorities. And I think this whole conversation, trying to preface it with, there's just still a lot that we don't know. I mean, we touched on it sooner about timelines. I mean, the signing of a pen of an executive action does not change what's happening on the ground the same day. Like there's a lot of things that I think if we could preach anything is patience and discernment as we kind of wait to see how these decisions actually do have domino effects, which they will, but we don't know what they're going to be yet. But on that one in particular, the incoming Secretary of Education is on the record of Pell Grants. I'd love to see them expanded, which is great. I think to your point, that's where people recognize the value, leaders have recognized the value over multiple administrations, and it seems like that's one that is still safe.
Yeah, and I think, part of this conversation too, as you listen to the Trump administration, and certainly as you heard Trump throughout the campaign trail, there was an emphasis in moving a lot of these things back to state level leadership. I don't know how the funding all works on that. I don't think that anyone's answered any of those questions. But I think the one thing that our families should recognize is that we still have a strong emphasis within the federal government side to continue to support higher education, to continue to support education K through 12, even if certain programs might be unfunded or defunded or funding taken away. I think the key things that we can rest assured on is that our federal government wants to see good stewardship, the resources and dollars that are spent. And some of these departments have become bureaucratic in the sense that, right now, even talking about mergers and acquisitions, it takes 2 or 3 years just to get through the process of a merger and acquisition in higher education, which may be too late for some institutions. So even that bureaucracy, or Title IX, for example, starts to take on a lot of agendas that aren't necessary. Certainly for religious education, I can say for SBU, the changes from the Biden administration to the Trump administration. The Trump administration is much more friendly to Christian higher education and religious liberty than what we were experiencing under the Biden administration, especially with regard to Title IX, which are regulations around housing and gender and all of these kinds of issues. So, there's one sense in which administrations can change and provide, positive relief, so to speak, for religious liberty and Christian higher education. And I think President Trump's administration is leaning into that. And I think for us as a Christian higher education religious institution, with the shared values of many other institutions like ourselves, we could be somewhat encouraged by some of the changes that are taking place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to even just broadly separating function from structure. So if we talk about the Department of Education as a structure, but the functions that it does have pre-existed it or could easily be or already work in partnership with other agencies. So if we talk about the FAFSA, for instance, which is administered by the Department of Education, not administered well last year. It's doing a little better.
Bit of a
better this year.
Transition,
but one of the things actually with the Simplification Act that led to the changes was more explicit connection between the FAFSA process and IRS
that's
information, because you're putting in tax information. It's like, why don't we just connect data that we already have? So if you think about, okay, is the FAFSA going to go away? Is federal aid going to go away? No, that function can still, I'd say, easily. I mean, that's a relative term. But yeah, IRS could take on the function of administering the FAFSA and
well, the Department
aid.
of Treasury. I mean, I think what would probably happen with say, for example, Title I or Title IV funding. Title I emphasizes federal funding toward, I think it's pre-K or K through 12 schools, certain schools that are identified. I'm not as familiar with all of the K through 12 type things, but certainly within the higher education realm, where Title IV funding really rests within kind of our sphere of influence. That Title I funding, Title IV funding could easily transition to the Department of Treasury. There's several other places, when you think about regulations like Title IX, those regulations that are in place and constantly changing, by the way. One of the interesting things about administration changes.
Now.
Yeah, it's interesting because they'll change with an administration, then the next administration will roll back things. And I will say, from a regulatory standpoint for institutions, whether you're K through 12 or higher education, post-secondary, one of the challenges is keeping up with all of the regulatory changes. And, we actually have offices that we're that level of bureaucracy creates additional bureaucracy at the boots on the ground level.
We now have to pay a Title IX coordinator who has
Exactly.
to do the research and take the seminars and
Right.
read all the press releases, all the stuff that comes out. Yeah, it creates an office for us, and we have to fund that office, and then that
Exactly.
person has to take on responsibilities. So it creates
Which then
a lot.
ultimately increases the cost of education. For
That's exactly
students.
right.
I mean,
So-
that gets passed on somewhere.
It absolutely does. And most institutions are tuition-driven institutions. We don't have a lot of additional funding. So it does get passed along to the student, right? So the increase in cost at the local level to address the bureaucratic regulatory changes are, literally constantly changing. And even in the middle of administrations, we'll get, new updates that we have to make changes to. And there's lots of reporting. That's another interesting aspect of the Department of Education. Some positive sides of that is, the data and statistics that provide us good resources across our country. I think that's been helpful. It's also kind of probably gotten way ambiguous in everything that they're doing. And, there's things around gainful employment, and there's things around all kinds of other regulatory changes where we're now having to spend quite a bit of time in producing reports and supporting data and providing that. That kind of takes us a little bit off mission of the work that we're doing here at the institution. So rolling back some of that or streamlining some of that could actually be very positive, I think, for higher education.
Yeah. Two of the things that have come out recently and more in the past week than sort of the initial blows that the executive orders had was pulling back spending on research funding for institutions, and then continuing the conversation. I know one of his other President Trump's campaign talking points was taxing endowments of universities. So if we think about how did those things, or do they impact a school like SBU? I mean, our endowment is not in the billions, to have a target on its back for the Trump administration or anything else.
Right.
So there's been no conversation that I've seen about we're not going to tax all endowments, but trying to find ones that are massive. Is there room or a conversation around taxing those? Maybe. But then also research funding. I mean, we're not a research R1 institution.
Correct.
And so some of these larger universities, a lot of state universities, I think of Mizzou as an example, that spend millions and millions of dollars.
They do research at Missouri?
They do. Yeah,
Really?
they research how to win basketball games this
Oh,
year, actually.
Actually, they're doing pretty
with
well with that
results.
this year.
Past research was not
finally, right?
conclusive.
It's been
This year it's been
85 research projects.
Do you guys always go to basketball? I mean, every one of these I've been on,
Yeah.
there's some
It's an
conversation
easy-
that-
It's on my mind.
It'll switch to football in the fall, I'm sure. But an institution like that has, and they're not just, it's not a pass through. They're not just getting money and it's going straight into research, because research is people, it's laboratories, it's GA positions, it's intern positions. And so these schools have built up this infrastructure. So less on the red tape, like we've talked about, building up infrastructure around Title IX and compliance, but this is more research infrastructure that now they're really going to feel a pinch on budgets and have to have some severe, hard conversations about cutting positions. There's a lot of schools that have already frozen hiring. And I think stepping back on it too, I would say, and this is opinion more than fact, I mean, there's probably a lot of waste in that. I mean, there's a lot of things that we probably are researching, using federal dollars for researching, that I would sit there and say, I don't want my tax dollars researching that, or paying for these positions. Are they really necessary? So there's an accountability through this whole process that I do think is healthy. it's messy a little bit at the moment, but I do think it's healthy. But it does have impacts on some of these institutions and what they will look like.
Yeah, and I think I think the accountability part is at the heart of what the Department of Education was really about. Was about accountability. I think trying to provide the right kind of accountability that we can improve the quality of our education across the entire spectrum, from primary through post-secondary education. And I think through that process, sometimes we look at the outcomes. One of the things and I haven't looked at all of the data on this, but one of the realities is our outcomes actually haven't improved since 1979. There's still the same level of illiteracy. There's still some of the same challenges
the K through 12 level and
exactly. Yeah. And one of the things we see, and some of this is post-COVID realities, but students, they're are entering students, and I'm not talking about just SBU, I'm talking about the entire spectrum of higher education. Students are having to take more remedial classes when they get to colleges and universities, which means they're not already learning that at the secondary level. So we recognize that there are some challenges for even just college readiness that's not happening through the K through 12. And that's not indicative of all K through 12. There's lots of great schools producing amazing students, and we have lots of them who are here. But we recognize kind of on the national scale, there's something that hasn't really, we've spent billions and billions of dollars and not really been able to see a return on that investment, right? So I think there should be a public outcry to that, so to speak. Accreditation, I think, is important from the standpoint that the process of accreditation helps institutions say, this is what we say we do, and we have an outside, much like a financial audit that we do every year with an outside auditor. An accreditor is an outside voice to say, yes, this is what they say they do, and this is what they actually do. And that accreditation, there are institutions, there are certainly fly-by-night institutions that shouldn't be getting federal funding, quite frankly, right? And so I think having that kind of that accreditation and accountability is important. How it's mandated, how it's set up on a federal or state level, all of those things could be, fleshed out for certain. But I think that the challenges that we as a university think about in the future, connected to some of these regulatory changes, accreditation changes, those kind of things, we want to be central to our mission. We want to be able to continue to flourish as an institution. We want to be able to make sure that we're producing students that are impacting the world for Christ, for that common good, and not be entrapped with all of these regulatory changes and things with regard to accreditation that aren't necessarily helpful to our institution. So accountability is good. Too much bureaucracy, bad, right? I mean, so you kind of end up with these dichotomies.
Yeah, and you start to, and I think right now, what feels messy and hard in the moment is a new administration's coming in, and I've enjoyed not everything that's been done and the way it's been done. There's, I kind of get some questions about how quickly we need to be signing executive orders, things like that. But what I do appreciate is the accountability piece that this administration seems to be unleashing on the federal government. So I don't know who would want to push against accountability. So
and
I think
stewardship. I think
right?
it's for us, that stewardship is a big word we use, but I think it is good stewardship for taxpayer dollars to say, how do we steward these dollars well? And if we are going to make federal and or state or local level investments, we want to see a return on investment, right? Yeah. I mean, the three of us are taxpayers. We have skin in the game, right?
We've been paying our taxes for 50 years or however long to the Department of Education, and we're seeing no return. Then it's a legitimate question to ask. Then do we need to do something different, right? And so I think those are good questions to be asking. That's something we do here. Like, I'm accountable, you're accountable, you're accountable.
Absolutely.
And how are we stewarding our spheres of influence? The same questions need to be asked to the Department of Education, to the federal government at large. Those are good questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see. I think one of the things, just to go back to as we start to wrap up, is we don't know all the answers. We don't know how all these pieces are going to come back together. There's a lot of things, just like anyone listening, is a wait and see. You didn't get any inside knowledge from our senators and DC of how this is all going to shake out, because everyone's sort of learning as we go.
Absolutely.
So preaching patience and preaching, I think, leaning into that stated goal of, okay, we do want accountability. We do want some streamlining. We do want things to be a little bit easier. We want, I think, in general, a little bit more local control and having visibility and access to those making decisions for the dollars that we get would be good. Less regulation would be good, without sacrificing total accountability, without sacrificing funding for things that are important. And I think some of these things we just kind of need to wait and see, and not just what the decisions that the administration wants to make, but this is going to be a court thing for a while. I mean, there's just a lot of things that are going to have to go through the court system, which I think is a goal of, frankly, the administration. They want to put some things to the court to test them, but it's going to take a while.
Yeah, yeah.
I think for Christian families, particularly, and Christian students here, hearing the news, seeing all the things that are going on, is to remember Romans 8. Remember that God is working all things together for the good of those who love him or are called according to his purpose. Ephesians 1, he works all things according to the counsel of his will. So for Christians, this kind of sober-minded steadiness of soul, the Lord is in control of all these things. No sparrow falls to the ground apart from his will. The lot is cast into the lap. Every decision is from the Lord. So you can just rest in that there's a God who's controlling these things. We're not panicking. Certainly at our level here, we're not sitting around, tearing in sackcloth and ashes, wondering what's the Lord going to do. We just trust that God has his plans and it's for our good. And we just are faithful to do what we need to do day by day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people can rest assured. I mean, people should not have high anxiety around these issues. People don't need to fret about this. I mean, everything that we see on the horizon still provides the same kind of federal funding and support for our institution that we can expect, the kind of direct loans and the kind of Pell Grant support. And again, a friendly administration to religious higher education. And I think that should be something we can celebrate and be grateful for and thank God for, that, in his kindness, we have an administration that supports the kind of institution that we are. And the college scorecard isn't going away. We'll still have metrics and measures that we can make sure that we uphold as an institution and be proud of, by the way. I mean, we have lots of things to celebrate. But for the student, I mean, if I'm a family and I'm thinking about how can I afford college, and I'm uncertain about the future of the Department of Education and federal funding, that may bring anxiety and fear in a real way. And I think our families can rest assured that those things, as far as we can see into the landscape of the future of higher education, will be there. They may not look the same. They may be in different departments, but it's the same type of processes and support that we received up to this point. For institutions like SBU, we feel very confident that will continue to be there. And our legislators continue to affirm that. Everything that we've heard and seen, certainly when I was on the Hill talking in those conversations, we continue to see that. So this is a good conversation. I love that you wanted to talk about this topic. I think it'll be helpful for families as they're thinking about what's the future impacts of how these things roll out.
30 seconds, 45 seconds. You left DC, you came back, but then you went to Texas. We're part of, there's a new IACE. Just real briefly, what is that and what we're excited about being part of that?
Yeah, absolutely. IACE, and I think it's the International Association of Christian Educators, if I'm not remembering the acronym correctly. David Dr started this group 5 or 6 years ago. One of the things I love about it is like-minded institutions like SBU that are really committed to the integration of faith and learning. And, one of the things that I think for us, one of the trends that we see, and I'll keep this to like the 30-second mark, but, evangelical institutions that are leaning into their Christian identity are actually growing. You hear a lot of nomenclature, a lot of conversation around institutions are losing students and these kind of things, but growing institutions are ones that are leaning into that Christian identity. We saw that last year. We had a 4% bump in the number of students that came to SBU. So, we're not shrinking back from our Christian identity. We're leaning into our Christian identity. So that emphasis on faith integration and everything that we do, I think, is so important. The spiritual and moral development that we provide as an institution, the holistic, teaching the whole person, you kind of mentioned this earlier, the strong community that we provide, the kind of commitment to service and mission, the sense of, the faculty and student relationships that we have. One of the things that's beautiful about a school like SBU that's a teaching school, we integrate faith and learning in everything we do, into every classroom, in every student life event, into every curricular and extracurricular activity. But the relationships really matter. Our faculty aren't off just only doing research. So we have some faculty that do research and writing and those kind of things, but they're really committed to teaching and equipping the next generation. I love that because we know that we're making an investment in students. And ultimately, we have, as an institution, we have a sense of purpose and calling. And, IACE is a lot of other institutions that are very like-minded to us, that are equipping the next generation with a sense of vocational calling and purpose to go into the world and make a difference. And that's what we're all about. I'm really excited about that.
That's great. Well, we're thankful that you're representing us at those tables and bringing back insights and continuing to push SBU in the right direction. And as things change in this conversation around what the administration's doing or regulations or funding things, we'll be on top of it. We'll continue to communicate directly with families as we learn more things that really do have impacts. But I think just to echo what you said, right now it's not status quo because there are things that are moving, but I think we can be encouraged that the things that really do impact our families in SBU are in place.
Yes, absolutely.
We feel confident.
And grateful for you guys and your leadership. You guys do amazing work.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Melson, for joining us. Safe travels to India
Off
next
to India
week.
tomorrow. We leave here about 10 and flight's 12:15.
We'll be praying for you.
I know.
Have a
Can't
great
wait to
trip.
hear those stories.
Great impact.
Yeah. Enjoy you like curry? Is that one of your?
Love it.
All right. Have some curry. There you go. And we'll be back next week. Take care.
Awesome.